Hi my quilt friends, this is Brigitte of Zen Chic. I'm here at Houston Quilt Market. We are in the Moda pop-up studio and I want to show you how to make these wonderful journal covers for any size. Let's get started. Before we get even started with the Hexie embellishment, let's start with a simple plain one to get the hang of it. Something like that. As I mentioned, you can make it for any size. So how do you know which measurement you need? That's pretty easy. You take your notebook, take a measurement tape like that, and now you wrap around the measurement tape from the front, wrap it around the book like that. Now you read that number, it says 12.5 inch. You add 1 inch, so you know the width is 13.5 inch. The same thing you can do for the length. You measure the length of the notebook, it says 8.5, add 1 inch, so you end up with 9.5. This is the size for my external and my lining fabric, 13.5 by 9.5. Another method for people who don't like the math or the measuring is you take a large piece of paper, you bring your notebook in, you wrap it around like that. If it has this little rubber band, you can just ignore it and slip that in the pocket in the end. I wrap the paper around and then I give it a good grease here and give it a good grease there. So the paper tells me now the right size of the fabric. Isn't that easy to do? Just like that. I already prepared one of these papers. Let me show you. See? I used that one with the wrapping method. And then I draw all the lines. This is without seam allowance. And the dashed line shows me the seam allowance. And that little line shows me where I will trim my lining. I will show you why I have to trim my lining. I have already prepared now my external fabric. As for the pockets, you can do any size. So what I did is mine are 8 inch wide plus the length of the journal, and I fold them in halves and press them and use them just like that. So much fun to put all those different fabric designs together. This is now my external fabric. And for my lining, I use something from the spotted line and it has the same size. And then I have my fusible web. But this, I made the exact size of the book cover, this shape without the seam allowance. Why would I do that? First, because later the seam allowance lets flat smoother, and also this edge gives me an idea where to put on the seam. That's why I made this lining exactly the size of the book itself. Now let's have a look on how we bring this all together for the cover. Okay, now I press on my fusible web onto the wrong side of my external fabric, like that. So it's nicely centered, and as I mentioned, you can see that the edges of this fusible web indicate where I have to saw later. This is now my first layer, and I put it right side up, like that. The next thing is I bring my pocket fabric on top. So with the fold showing inwards, I place it exactly that the edges are matching like that. If you want to, you can even go with a seam in between and then split the large pocket into 2 smalls or 3 smalls, whatever you like that. Then the next thing would be to bring your lining with the right side showing downwards on top, like that. So usually we do the lining the same size as the external fabric. But I figured out if I want to turn the complete thing later and I would have to close that gap hand stitching, that wouldn't be that perfect as I would like it. So what can I do instead? I just make my lining smaller and have an open gap which is hidden through the pocket. Isn't that a clever idea? So I trim off about 2 or 3 inches from my lining fabric here, so it's a little bit smaller. Let me demonstrate it. So it looks a little bit more set size. And then I stitch it all around. See, this is my fusible web, and my red seam shows I give a little bit of space, let's say an 16th or an 8-inch, so that it covers the width of my book cover, like that. So I don't go exactly on the edge of the fusible web. I give a bit of space. I sew around on that fusible web, and since I started with an inch of seam allowance, I had a ½ inch here, ½ inch here. I trim it just back to 2¼ of an inch. We don't need that much seam allowance here. It would create too much bulk. Now when we have sized it, we turn it around. We open that gap. It doesn't matter if it is fraying. It is getting hidden anyway. So the pocket has to show up on the lining side, so I have to flip that. And you can see the pocket will now cover this open gap. See? Now I have just to poke out the corners. If you are asking me what tool I'm using, this is actually from a book maker, do you say so? Someone who makes books. So I found that very helpful. You might have different things here. So this flappy strap can now be hidden in the little pocket here. We slip it in. Of course, you would give it first a good press, but let's keep that step for our tutorial. Now, when you want to bring in the other half here, it's very easy if you really open it like that and hold it down. And your book is now doing yoga. Don't know how this pose is called in yoga. Like that, see? And now when you fold it, it's such a perfect fit. Oh, I could even stitch my name in this little gap here. So in the next step, I want to talk about how we bring these hexagons on the cover. So first, let's talk about how to hand base the hexagons. But before we can bring on the hexagons onto the cover, we have to prepare them at first. Let me show you what I need. I have a bunch of little squares. These are 2½ by 2½ inches. Also, you could use up your scraps for this project. Isn't it just easy to have a wonderful collection? I would recommend to use Simply Cozy by, what was the name? Zen Chic, I guess. Also, you need hexagons. You can start with any shape, but for these squares, the 1-inch hexagon is the perfect size. 1 inch means this side of the hexagon is 1 inch long. I love these pre-cut ones, and you will find them in any shop, I guess. They're pretty convenient to get. Also, you can cut down the shape of your square to a hexagon itself. Instead, I start right away with my square. I bring it on the wrong side of my little square, centered like that. And to hold it in place, I pin it. I pin from the wrong side, so I stick through and then go again like that. And I have already threaded my needle. So I fold just the first thing over like that, hold it with a finger, with my thumb, for example, and hold the thumbnail at the edge of my paper. So I have clear and crisp corner like that. And then I just go through the both layers like that, lay the tail of, let's say, 1 inch, and go through one more time like that. I don't need a knot. No, I don't need one. Now, again, I hold with my fingernail near to the edge and flip that other edge over to have a really crisp corner. Then I go down through the both layers like that and do it for a second time. And that's good enough. Again, I go all the way around, making those crisp corners. It's such a calming thing, like you would meditate. So for example, if I listen to a podcast or I want to just unwind from a busy day, I really enjoy to sit here hand stitching. So when you come to the end, this is my nearly last corner. And for the very last corner, again, hold it down with your fingernail to the edge and make sure you really have a crisp fold here and give it a stitch. And then you can just clip off, trim off, clip this thread about and leave a tail of an inch about that. Okay, this is now your hexagon shape. And you make a complete bunch of those. I made about, let's say, 35 for my journal. You can do as much as you like to. Let me talk a bit about why I do hand basting instead of gluing, which I could also do. Because now when I want to bring my hexagon down on the cover, I have to pull out my paper first. And if I glue it only on, then the seam can flip back. But if I leave the basting stitches on, they will be kept in shape like these. So that's why I prefer hand basting over gluing. Let's go forward with this little hexie. So I have now basted everything and I pull out a pin and I can now give it a good press first. You can even give it a little bit of starch to keep those edges crisp. And then I pull out the paper, like that. You can reuse the paper quite often. Now, I prepare it even further because later, when I want to bring it onto my journal cover, they should stick before I go over them with my seams. So how can I make that? I figured that I like to iron on a two-sided fusible web. It's just a little 1-inch square, something like that. And I have prepared a couple of those, a whole bunch of those, I would say. I have even prepared the journal cover, and you only prepare the external fabric at first, and then later, when it's all stitched on, you go forward to make the lining and the pocket and stuff like that. Make a whole bunch of these with these little glue sticks, I would say, on. I made about 35 or a little bit more, and I show you in a minute how we bring that onto the cover. Now, when you want to position your hexagons on a kind of a hexagon grid, and you need to know, where exactly should be the place, you mark yourself such a grid on top of your fabric. I would recommend to go with a calm background fabric, like a spotted, would be perfect. And then you mark this grid with water soluble or with maybe a friction, whatever. So you can download this grid on my site and then lay it on a layer table and trace it through. Easy peasy. Now you start positioning your hexagon to your liking. I like mine a little bit asymmetric, like thrown, whatever you prefer, like that. And now these little glue dots come into play. I start with the most bottom row and press it on so that I don't disturb my drawing. So first I want to scratch this glue paper like that, and then I can easily rip it off and have only the glue points. And then I place it where I want it to. And then I go to my ironing mat like that. See, you want to center it inside that grid. And then just give it a good press and be careful not to erase your grid lines where they are still needed, like that. So next one, scratch it get rid of that paper. Position it next in the grid and give it a good press, like that. In this manner you go forward until you have finished your complete surface to your liking. Before we can now put the complete journal together, we have to fix the hexagons with some stitches on the sewing machine. Let's do that. To hold all our hexagons in place, we now stitch them down. I use an invisible thread so the thread doesn't show off. My favorite brand here is YLI because it behaves like a weak and thin hair. You don't see it. I would like to stitch this grid onto the hexagons, but I erased all the lines already. Doesn't matter. I can just eyeball. I go from tip to the next tip and then in between to the next tip in between, and just eyeball my lines. Let's start with the straight lines here. And I start by going through my first tip and just follow this estimated or guessed or eyeballed, whatever you will call it, line, all the way down until the edge, like that. And then I use leader ender fabric and now I start with the second vertical row. Again, go through the first tip. This is not my machine, it's a rent one, and I feel not very used to it. So we both are not married so far. Maybe it will end in an engagement, I am not sure. I'm pretty happy with what I have at home. Are you with yours too? So let's turn it around. So you got finally the idea what's going on here. Okay, baby, behave. Otherwise, I won't divorce my elder one. Okay. So in the same manner, you do all your vertical rows and then you go forward with all the diagonal rows. So let's start with those. Again, I go from this peak and through the complete hexagon and to the next one, and so on. It's really easy to do. You just eyeball. The thread is invisible anyway. And I go all the way through until the edge. Now let's pretend you have all stitched up and it's done. What you do as a last step is you trim off the excess fabric of the hexagons, so aligning the edge of your base, of your external fabric. And from there on, you go forward with the first instructions on how to make the journal cover. And then you have your special embellished one. So you get all the measurements, you know, you can do any size of journal you want. You just take your own measurements and start from there. So I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed doing it for you. Get all the detailed information on my blog post, linked in the description box below. You will find me at brigitteheitland.de. See you there.